Hey guys, it is the Political Kid, and today we're going to be talking about on what you voted for. What if the 1912 election not just divided the Republican Party, but also the Democratic Party? Now you might be wondering, why would the Democrats divide when they could just win since the Republicans were in shambles? Well, there is an issue that they actually had. Champ Clark, the Speaker of the House, was actually in the lead and had the majority, but not the two-thirds majority needed to win the nomination. And only because of William Jennings Bryan endorsement of Woodrow Wilson and the delegates' eventual drifting towards Woodrow Wilson was he able to get the delegates and the votes on his side. And it took so many ballots for him to finally get the nomination. So in this timeline, we're going to have the Democrats also in shambles with more moderates going with Champ Clark and have the Southern Democrats break away from the Democratic Party and nominate Woodrow Wilson, who was born in the South, so they could get a Southerner in the White House for a long time. So this would end up to be a consequential election, and it was in our timeline, considering that anybody who won the election would change history. But now it's even more interesting considering that there's actually five parties. There's the progressives, there's the socialists, actually, with Eugene Debs, there's the Republicans, there's the Democrats, and now we added a Southerner party, which would probably be named like the Constitutional Union Party. So it seemed like they're for the Union, but their goals is just for the South. You might be wondering why this video is so long, considering that it's only one scenario and my other videos are only like 12 minutes. So why is this scenario long? Well, we're actually going to break this up into four different parts. What if Champ Clark won? What if Woodrow Wilson won? What if Theodore Roosevelt won? And what if William Howard Taft won? So, and then we're going to be talking about how that would affect policies, foreign and domestic, and the elections after that. So we're going to start with what if Champ Clark won? Since the progressives had a lot of movement from the normal conservative Republicans to them, and a lot of people still thought Teddy Roosevelt is a popular person, that would divide up a lot of the Republican votes. And let's see in this timeline that the Democrats are able to perceive the Constitutional Union Party as just like a southern, ambitious, and like not even a real threat. Just like make them seem like a regular third party and not really anything of importance. We could have them win. We could have them win certain states, and with Eugene Debs, I think he would take more from Teddy Roosevelt in this timeline. For a lot of those progressive supporters, he would take that, and that would give Champ Clark a good foothold in the North and a little bit out west. Like, I could see him winning Oregon, New York, Pennsylvania, and other states. However, not as many progressive states like California, Washington, like Michigan. Not that kind of, but like just swing states back then. And that would give him enough to go over the finish line. And since he was a moderate Democrat, people would probably be more inclined to vote with a more pragmatic, more reasonable candidate, since there was extremes on both sides with Wilson and Teddy Roosevelt in this timeline, and also Eugene Debs, when they could go with a more reasonable candidate like Taft and Clark. So you might think that policy might be different from this timeline, although Champ Clark was opposed to going to war in World War One, and although he would probably personally try to not he would be isolationist more, and he would still probably win re-election in 1916. he would probably have to go into war around the same time as Woodrow Wilson did, and not a lot would change about the war. However, the peace deal would look different as Woodrow Wilson was more lenient towards Germany. So in this timeline, they would Clark would be less lenient towards Germany and would let France take the Saarland and Poland take Danzig, the entirety of Danzig, and just made sure that Germany was more of a crippled state than it was in our timeline. Also go back to the 1916 election, as Champ Clark would get a lot of support from Southern Democrats, as the Constitutional Union Party would probably implode in itself, and the Republicans would have more of a crisis like would have more of a crisis as Eugene Debs would take a lot of progressives, and that means that Republicans wouldn't have as much support in the 1960 election, and that means that Champ Clark would probably win the same amount of electoral votes, however, with a more popular vote victory and a more of a majority in California, which would give him the election. Now that the parties are kind of unified again, there are still some wounds, and that would definitely appear in the 1920 election, as I could definitely see Warren Harding still running as the Republicans were very divided, and it would probably and the Champ Clark wouldn't be as popular, so they'd go with a more dark horse candidate to appeal to a lot of people. Uh, I'm not so sure that James Cox would win the nomination as Democrats, but it wasn't really matter, as Republicans were really popular in the 1920 election, so I could still see Warren Harding winning and then dying in 1923. And then 1924 would be actually surprisingly different, as the progressives with Robert La Follette would actually have more support than they did in our timeline, winning more states in the Midwest, not just Wisconsin, which would even open the wounds more for the Republicans, but it wouldn't be enough so that the Republicans would still win with Calvin Coolidge. In 1928, progressives would really be mad, since their issues wouldn't be as represented in the in the term of Coolidge, so they would still be out to get a progressive candidate, and the Republicans would still nominate someone like Hoover, as he was still popular. However, the Democrats would actually have more of a chance, as I could see them nominating someone other than Al Smith, and I don't know who would that be, but I could see someone more similar to Franklin Roosevelt winning the nomination, but it would still not be enough, as Herbert Hoover would still win with a less majority, though. In 1932, Franklin Roosevelt would still come in with an agenda. However, the progressives would take a few votes away from the Republicans, as within the 1920s, they would form a more pact with the socialists, and to make the socialist progressive party, which would make America more divided, as conservatives in the Deep South would also feel not as represented, and would form their own party, not the Constitutional Union Party, but just more they would express more of their southern beliefs, so they could try to win it, and both would kind of be seen as third parties, and would barely get any electoral votes at all during this whole timeline, but would still be a force to be reckoned with, and the establishment of the Republican and Democrats would still have to appeal to a lot more people in this timeline. Germany would still probably go to war with the Allies. However, they'd have a less capable army as there would be more restrictions on Germany. However, they would still go to war and probably defeat Poland and France, however, at a slower rate, which would make Americans feel a little bit less inclined to join the war. However, they were still supportive of the Lend-Lease Act that Roosevelt would do after he won a second term in a landslide against all three other candidates. So, yeah, in 1940, he would have a hard time getting the nomination as conservatives within the party would really try to get John Nance Garner to be the nominee. So, but it wouldn't. But the moderate Democrats would still support Roosevelt, and he would still be elected to 4 terms, and we'd still be going to war with Germany. And because of the restrictions we put on them during after World War One, the Germans would probably lose and capitulate sooner, probably around January or February of 1945. And I could see the Allies getting a little bit more territory. However, it wouldn't be that much, but it would still be something. And Harry Truman would become president, and the 1948 election actually had a Southern candidate and a progressive candidate. However, they really have a more range of voters within those two parties, with the Southerner Democrats making an alliance with Southerners and also more Union voters, creating the Dixiecrat Party, and would be a huge thorn to the Democrat Party, and also the progressives, who would take away some votes from the Republicans and some votes from the Democrats. And this could cause a rift within the Democratic Party and would lead Thomas Dewey to win. However, it wouldn't be that much, and I could see Thomas Dewey only getting 280 electoral votes. So for his term, he would be very unpopular with the majority of Americans, though. Thomas Dewey would still probably get into the Korean War. However, it would be a little bit delayed, not by much, but still something, and it would still have the stalemate that it have in our timeline. However, I think that Thomas Dewey might make a peace settlement way earlier than what happened in our timeline, so I could see the war ending around before election, like in the 1952 election, because the Germans were more easily defeated. Eisenhower would be more popular, and he would realize that the Republicans would not have a good chance of winning, and decided that since he was a more moderate, he would run for the Democratic Party. Now, there was a few challenges from Estes Kefauver and Adlai Stevenson that would be in his way. However, he'd win the nomination and go with Stevenson as his running mate. And although there would definitely still be some worries that he was too moderate, and that the third parties of the progressives and the Dixiecrats would gain too much, he would still have a comfortable lead and win over 300 electoral votes and still become president, however, as a moderate Democrat. A lot of his policies would still be passed. However, since he was a more moderate, Social Security would be kept around the same current state it was at that time. So his current state it was, however, a little bit expanded, since Thomas Dewey would probably try to lower it and during his presidency, and Eisenhower would win re-election, still build the highway system, maybe even a little bit earlier, since he was now a Democratic president, and his presidency would still be around the same popularity. Now, I don't think that Adlai Stevenson, even though he would be the vice president, would have a good chance of running, since by then he would be an older candidate, and they would want someone new and someone to appeal to the South. So I could definitely see John F. Kennedy winning the nomination with a Southern Democrat as his running mate. And for the Republicans, I could see Richard Nixon getting the nomination. Although he wouldn't have as much experience, which would kind of hurt him, and John F. Kennedy would win the 1960 election. He would still be assassinated, and the Southern candidate would still probably be LBJ. I forgot to mention that, but it would still be the same. However, since the Republicans would probably not run Barry Goldwater, they'd probably run with someone like Nelson Rockefeller. They'd still lose, but LBJ would not win by as much and only win about 320 electoral votes, give or take. And he would only gain like 45% of the popular vote, as the progressives and the Dixiecrats would take a large portion, like a small but large portion of the popular vote. His term would still go the same, as he would get involved with Vietnam. However, the Democrats would not be as popular, and I could see Robert F. Kennedy winning the nomination, and like he would probably not be assassinated, since he would have an easier time winning the nomination, and he wouldn't have to go to California to actually campaign there, and that is where he was assassinated. But during the general election, he would still probably lose, as the Democrats would not be popular, even though Robert F. Kennedy was distant from LBJ. He would still probably lose. However, probably not to Richard Nixon, as Richard Nixon didn't have much as an appeal to him. And I could see George Romney getting a grassroots movement and winning the nomination and eventually the presidency. However, the progressives would actually turn back into the socialist would turn back from the socialists, as the Socialist Party was banned. So a lot of socialists had no choice but to join the progressives anyway. So the progressives, throughout the rest of this timeline, would be way more popular, and I could see them winning states like Vermont and Massachusetts being a swing state, even though it was a heavily Democratic state. And the Dixiecrats would still probably win the South, with Wallace probably running for the Dixiecrats. In 1972, as George Romney was slowly getting troops out of Vietnam, he would probably have a smooth re-election. However, the Democrats would probably not nominate McGovern, as he was seen as too liberal, and they would probably nominate a moderate, maybe they ran Hubert Humphrey. However, he would still lose, and he would only do a little bit better than McGovern did. But so George Romney would have a smooth two-term presidency, and yeah, there's no Watergate, so the Republicans would still be popular, and I could see Gerald Ford running based on his experience and barely winning the election, as the economy got better, and he wouldn't have a bad performance in the debates between. Now they would start allowing the Dixiecrats and the progressives in the debates. However, they would eventually move the Dixiecrats out of the debates and only have a three-way debate between progressives, Democrats, and Republicans. So progressives would still do better, winning states like Washington, Massachusetts, Vermont, which would take away a lot of Democratic support, which would give Republicans the victory to Gerald Ford. Now, Gerald Ford would have an okay presidency. I mean, the Iran affair, Iran hostage crisis would still happen. However, I could see him getting the hostages back quicker and within his term. He was too old considering his age, and in 1980, I could definitely see someone like Ronald Reagan trying to run, even though he was old, but he still was charismatic. And then the Democrats would probably pick Ted Kennedy to split the progressive supports between him and the progressives so they could get a larger percent of the popular vote and electoral vote. And in this time, Ted Kennedy would beat Ronald Reagan since the economy was stagnant, even if Gerald Ford was president. And yeah, the Iran hostage crisis would still hurt him. So Ted Kennedy would probably win. In 1984, Ted Kennedy would probably get an easy re-election. In 1988, his vice president, who might be a Southerner, I don't know who, but there might be a grassroots movement, and Lloyd Bentsen might have been the vice president, and I could see Lloyd Bentsen with Michael Dukakis as his running mate, winning in 1988. Now, in 1992, Lloyd Bentsen would not be as popular as he was getting too old, and there would be a huge grassroots movement for Michael Dukakis to replace him in the general election. However, that wouldn't happen, and the Democrats would lose substantially to progressives getting a fairly significant portion of the electoral vote, about like 90 or so, but still it would be a lot, and Republicans would win in 1992 with someone like George H.W. Bush. George H.W. Bush would probably go on to win in 1996 as the Cold War would have ended. The Cold War would have ended, and he would help people who were in the communist system get into the free world, and he was just a popular guy, kind of like what Bill Clinton was in 1996. And in 2000, I could see John McCain winning in 2000. And the progressives would slowly turn into a Green Party, as many progressives would flock to the Democrats, and the Dixiecrat Party would slowly evolve into the Conservative Party, as the issue of civil rights was not as substantial, and it would slowly turn into a grassroots movement for conservatives. And in 2000, I could see John McCain winning. In 2004, I could see him winning re-election. However, he would probably have a running mate who was fairly conservative to appeal to those. In 2008, I could see Barack Obama, who would probably originally be for the Progressive Party. However, Democrats would see that they would want to cut into that progressive support, so they would nominate Obama with probably Hillary Clinton as his running mate. He would win in 2012. And then in 2016, Hillary probably wouldn't run, and Joe Biden would run for the Democrats. Jill Stein would run for the Progressives. Donald Trump would run for the Republicans, and I don't know who would run for the Conservative Party, but it would definitely be a fairly conservative. Trump would still probably win, as the Conservative Party wouldn't be that popular, and the progressives dug deep into the Democratic support, and Donald Trump would probably still win re-election. However, he would have to choose a conservative vice president as his running mate, so to fuse the parties together to beat the progressives and Democrats. And then in 2024, I could see someone like Josh Shapiro winning. Now we're going to be talking about how William Howard Taft won re-election somehow. So in this timeline, we'd have a few of the radical progressives for Theodore Roosevelt go in more support for Eugene Debs and the socialists. And also the Democratic Party with Champ Clark would also have would only really attack the Southern Democrats so they could get a win, allowing William Howard Taft to appeal to a lot of moderates and able to win the North, the Midwest, and parts of the West, which would gain him the Electoral College. However, most Americans would not vote for him. About 65% of Americans voted for somebody else in this election, and that would make him a really unpopular president during his second term. And now, in 1916, the Republicans basically have no chance of winning, and the Southern Democrats fused with the Democrats again to obliterate the Republicans in 1916. And the Republicans nominate a moderate of Charles Evans Hughes, while Theodore Roosevelt decides not to run. Hiram Johnson does run for the Progressives in 1916. That it would cause the Democrats to win, and it would probably go to someone who was in the Democratic Party for a long time, James Cox, who actually ran in 1920 and would be a more moderate approach, and he would go on to win. He would also go on to win re-election in 1920 after World War I ended, and he would have a more stable foreign policy. In 1924, Calvin Coolidge, a younger, more moderate Republican, would win against a Robert La Follette for the Progressives, and the Democrats would do terribly, so Calvin Coolidge would easily win 1924, and he would actually be more inclined to run for re-election in 1928, and his second term would go terribly, with the Great Depression happening, and his running mate, Charles Curtis, deciding to run in 1932, since Calvin Coolidge was a two-term president. Franklin Roosevelt would absolutely demolish him, getting about 500 electoral votes and kicking the Republicans out of the White House. 1936, 1940, and 1944, Franklin Roosevelt would win re-election. However, Henry Wallace would not be dropped off in the 1944 election and would assume the office of the presidency because the Democrats would want more progressives like him on their side. Now, Henry Wallace would be a candidate that would unify the progressives and the Democrats together, since the Southern Democrats would split away in the 1948 election and run against both the Republican Party, who would run Thomas Dewey, and the Democratic Party, who would run Henry Wallace, even though there would be a grassroots campaign to get Eisenhower to get the nomination. And Henry Wallace would probably still win, as he wouldn't be as internationalist as Truman was. However, he'd still probably do an airlift for West Berlin, and he would support limited aid to Europe and their allies. So he would win 1948 in a limited margin with a Southerner, probably, maybe not a Southerner, maybe like Alben Barkley, who was the vice president, and would win. In 1952, Adlai Stevenson would not have a good chance to run, since Henry Wallace was a liberal candidate, and he was very unpopular, and Adlai Stevenson was a liberal candidate, and so he would be unpopular. And so Estes Kefauver would win the nomination, however, would lose to Robert Taft and Eisenhower as the vice president. In 1956, Robert Taft would win a re-election. In 1960, Eisenhower would not run since he was too old. However, his friend, Richard Nixon, would run. And then John F. Kennedy, a new face with LBJ, would surprisingly beat Richard Nixon. And And finally, the federal highway system, which was delayed by Robert Taft, would be passed during the John F. Kennedy presidency, and Kennedy would have to be way more moderate so he could get more Southern support, and also not being too, not still as being too away from the progressives. So, he wouldn't really go and campaign and go around the country as much, and I'd say that John F. Kennedy would survive in this timeline. In 1964, he would win re-election. However, it would be in a smaller margin, considering that the Civil Rights Act would just be passed, and it would be a more dividing issue for the country. In 1968, LBJ would not be the candidate that people would want. However, they would support LBJ's friend, Hubert Humphrey, with Bobby Kennedy as his running mate. And since John F. Kennedy wasn't as supportive of escalating the war as much as LBJ did, Vietnam would not be as big of an issue, and Hubert Humphrey with Robert F. Kennedy would go on and win the 1968 election against George Romney. In 1972, Hubert Humphrey would win re-election, and in 1976, Robert F. Kennedy would try to run for the nomination, and he would do good with Jimmy Carter as his running mate and would be able to win the 1976 election against Gerald Ford and Bob Dole. However, his presidency would be marked with economic downturn, the Iran hostage crisis, and many just issues within America and abroad, and so he would decide not to run for re-election as he knew his chances were basically over, but let RFK's running mate Jimmy Carter run in 1980 against Ronald Reagan, and Jimmy Carter would do actually a little bit better than he did in our timeline, since Robert F. Kennedy would have a lot of liberal policies that would appeal to a lot of progressives, and Reagan wouldn't be able to get a lot of Dixiecrats on his side without alienating a lot of moderates. So Jimmy Carter would do better. However, he would still lose to Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan would win re-election in 1984, and then George H.W. Bush would win in 1988, and then Lloyd Benson would run with Joe Biden as his running mate and would go on to beat George H.W. Bush in 1992. In 1996, Joe Biden would win the nomination because Lloyd Benson would probably drop out, and he would win the election. In 2000, Joe Biden would probably decide not to run for re-election and would let his friend and Southerner Al Gore run, and Al Gore would probably win, as Joe Biden would be a less risky candidate. And then Al Gore would win re-election in 2004, and then John McCain would beat Barack Obama in 2008, and then Mitt Romney would run in 2012. McCain wouldn't run for re-election, and Mitt Romney would win against a Democratic candidate. In 2016, Mitt Romney would run again. However, Bernie Sanders would be nominated for the Democrats to combine the progressives and the Democrats, and would win in 2016, and then go on to win in 2020. And then in 2024, Ron DeSantis would win the election, and then in an upset against Bernie Sanders' running mate, who would be Kamala Harris. Now we're going to be talking about what if Woodrow Wilson still won with the Constitutional Union Party, and the election would be a deadlock between the four candidates, and it would go to the House and Senate. So, and with Woodrow Wilson winning the most electoral votes, Champ Clark would make a deal with Woodrow Wilson that Champ Clark would be vice president and Woodrow Wilson would be president. This would upset a lot of Democrats who voted for a more moderate option and just upset most of Americans. And Woodrow Wilson's term would be marked by like a revenge-seeking Republican Party in 1916 with Charles Evans Hughes uniting the progressives and Republicans to beat Woodrow Wilson in the 1916 election, and then after they and then going to war with Germany and being a little more harsher on Germany than Woodrow Wilson is, and would go on to give France the Saarland, make sure that the Rhineland was demilitarized, and would make sure that France and Britain wouldn't be afraid to go to war if the Germans tried to do something, and so that the European powers could be prepared. In 1920, Charles Evans Hughes with Hiram Johnson would go on to win a re-election. In 1924, although there would be a significant pushback from the Democratic Party, Calvin Coolidge would win the election of 1924, and then Hiram Johnson would run for the election in 1928, and he would try to run for the re-election in 1932, but because of the Great Depression, he would lose to Franklin Roosevelt, who brought together a party that was disunited with the Constitutional Union Party, but was able to bring it back with John Nance Garner as his running mate, and had a good had a good few terms. And instead of John Nance Garner trying to run for president in 1940, they kind of just both agreed that they would just keep their jobs and tried to keep going. However, in 1944, to keep progressives with Franklin Roosevelt, Henry Wallace would be chosen, and then Henry Wallace would become president. However, he wouldn't run for the election in 1948, and they would choose a moderate Harry Truman to run in 1948 against Thomas Dewey, and Thomas Dewey and Strom Thurmond, Thomas Dewey would probably win. However, his term would be marked by economic downturn, the Korean War, and would hurt the Republicans' chances. And in 1952, Adlai Stevenson would win, and then go on to win a second term with S.D. Kefauver as his running mate. In 1960, John F. Kennedy would defeat Richard Nixon. In 1964, LBJ, who would still be the vice president, would win against Barry Goldwater. In 1968, Bobby Kennedy would lose to Richard Nixon. In 1972, Richard Nixon would win against George McGovern. In 1976, Ronald Reagan would win the primaries against Gerald Ford and go on to win against Jimmy Carter. However, because of the economic downturn and the Iran hostage crisis, Ted Kennedy would barely win in the 1980 election. In 1984, there would be a huge pushback from George H.W. Bush, but Ted Kennedy would still win re-election. In 1988, Bob Dole would run and be able to beat Ted Kennedy's running mate of Lloyd Benson and be able to win. In 1992, Michael Dukakis would run against Bob Dole and would be able to win. In 1996, Bill Clinton would run after Michael Dukakis decided not to run for re-election against a young Dan Quayle, and Bill Clinton would win. And then in 2000, because of Bill Clinton's unpopularity due to his scandals, Al Gore would run and be defeated by John McCain. In 2004, John McCain would win re-election. In 2008, Hillary Clinton would win, and Barack Obama as her running mate. She would win re-election in 2012, however, by a very small margin. In 2016, Marco Rubio would go on to defeat Barack Obama due to Democrats' unpopularity and the scandals of Hillary Clinton. In 2020, Joe Biden would be able to try to run. However, Bernie Sanders would win the nomination, trying to get progressives and to vote against Marco Rubio, and would be able to win in 2020, and then would lose re-election to DeSantis in 2024, leading up to our modern day. Well, now we're going to be talking about what if Teddy Roosevelt did win and was able to garner a progressive movement within the Republican Party. Instantly, he would bring a lot of reform to the conservative policies of William Howard Taft, and he would be considered a moderately popular president. However, most Americans didn't vote for him, so that was still an issue. In 1916, Teddy Roosevelt would go to war with Germany because of the sinking of the Lusitania, and would be able to win the election of 1916 with Hiram Johnson as his running mate, and was able to get back the Republican Party together in that election. In 1919, sadly, Teddy Roosevelt, who had won World War I and was able to keep a non-Soviet Russia able to survive, considering that they would beat the Germans early with kicking out the Tsar. However, the Soviets would not come into power, and Teddy Roosevelt would sadly die in 1919, with Hiram Johnson becoming president, and he would run for re-election. He would run for the election in 1920 with Calvin Coolidge as his running mate, and it would be a very close election. However, James Cox wouldn't be able to get the enough electoral votes, and Hiram Johnson would barely win the election. In 1924, Calvin Coolidge would run. However, he would not run in 1928, and he would win 1924, and would have Herbert Hoover as Calvin Coolidge's running mate. In 1928, Herbert Hoover would decide not to run, and instead would let Charles Curtis run, and he would win the 1928 election by a little bit. However, Democrats, after losing so many elections, were sick and tired, and then after the Great Depression, they gained a supermajority within Congress, blocking every single bill that Charles Curtis tried to pass, and then dominated with Franklin Roosevelt winning, with Henry Wallace as Roosevelt's running mate. In 1940, after the two-term presidency of Franklin Roosevelt, he would drop Henry Wallace for a more moderate John Nance Garner, who would be able to win in 1940. However, he would decide to drop him in 1944 and go with Harry Truman, and Truman would assume the presidency and go on to win in 1948, similar to our timeline. In 1952, Estes Kefauver would probably be able to win the nomination, as Truman would be a little bit more popular as a lot of the world issues that were caused by Woodrow Wilson wouldn't happen, and he was able to, and World War II wouldn't cause as many casualties, and Germany would be defeated quicker, being able to be defeated by under Franklin Roosevelt's presidency, and he would have a lot of good credentials. However, he would drop out, endorse Kefauver, and then with Adlai Stevenson as his running mate against Robert Taft, with Richard Nixon as Taft's running mate, and Robert Taft would be barely able to win in 1952, and would barely lose to an Adlai Stevenson in 1956, as the Republicans wouldn't be popular after the Democrats tried to get a federal highway system. However, Robert Taft would block it, and Adlai Stevenson would be able to become president. In 1960, although Adlai Stevenson was fairly popular, John F. Kennedy was able to win the nomination in a grassroots movement, but because of the difficulties within the Democratic Party and in the disillusionment, and Adlai Stevenson being reluctant to endorse Kennedy, Richard Nixon would be able to win in 1960, win in 1964, and then his running mate Henry Lodge would run in 1968. However, Hubert Humphrey would win in 1968, going on to win in 1972, and then Hubert Humphrey's running mate, Edmund Muskie, would try to run in 1976. However, Republicans would really be popular with a Reagan in charge of the Republican Party, being able to win with Reagan and Gerald Ford as Reagan's running mate, be able to win in 1976, and then lose in 1980 because of the economic downturn and the Iran hostage crisis, unfortunately. But Ted Kennedy, who would win in 1980 with Lloyd Bentsen as Ted Kennedy's running mate, would be able to mark some economic upturn, and the 1980s would be liberal in 1980s. And in 1988, I don't really know. However, I could see them trying to go with a more moderate option, like Joe Biden in 1988. And then George H.W. Bush would try to run in 1988. And because of George H.W.'s good attack ads on Joe Biden and Joe Biden's gaffe with the October surprise of people learning that he plagiarized his speech, and George H.W. Bush barely winning the 1988 election and going on to lose to Bill Clinton in 1992. And then same thing would happen on our timeline with 1996. In 2000, Joe Lieberman would actually become the nominee and would go on to beat George W. Bush. Joe Lieberman would win in 2004, and then Hillary Clinton would go on to win in 2008 and 2012. Barack Obama would win in 2016. Marco Rubio would win in 2020 and 2024, and that brings us to the modern day. Well, this was a long one, folks, and if you guys want me to do more things like this, go check out my other videos, comment, subscribe, talk to other content creators about my existence on this platform. I'm trying to tell people and trying to get people to understand more about politics, and I hope you all have a great February, and goodbye.